pilot who helped photograph a billion-dollar marijuana plantation was tortured to death alongside the DEA agent he flew for. The most valuable informant in American history was shot in a parking lot after a court made his location public. A single leaked phone number sent gunmen into a Mexican border town and killed hundreds. These are 10 horrifying cases of cartel snitches who got killed. Section 1. Alfredo Zavala Avila. Alfredo Zavala Avila was a Mexican government pilot in an era when knowing the country's mountains too well was becoming a very dangerous kind of knowledge. By the early 1980s, he had spent years flying aerial reconnaissance missions over western Mexico on behalf of American-funded anti-drug programs, looking down from aircraft over the folded mountain ranges where the states of Sinaloa, Durango, and Chihuahua pressed together in some of the most remote terrain in North America. The work required patience and a tolerance for long, solitary hours aloft. It also required a particular kind of skill. From altitude, a trained observer could distinguish the patterns of a cultivated field from natural growth, could spot the specific color and regularity that mature marijuana plants cast across a hillside when seen from the right angle in certain light. Zavala had those skills, and the programs that needed them kept him busy. The effort was known in its earlier phase as Operation Condor, an ambitious joint campaign between Mexico and the United States aimed at locating and destroying drug crops before they could be harvested and moved north. Mexican soldiers went into the mountains in large numbers. Eradication teams followed aerial spotters who radioed down coordinates. Helicopter crews backed ground teams that burned fields once the locations were confirmed. The aerial component of all of this was essential, and pilots like Zavala were the ones who made it work. They were the eyes that the operation depended on, the people who flew low enough to confirm a suspected site and high enough to escape notice, long enough to do the job. Zavala participated in those missions for roughly 4 years, long enough to accumulate an intimate familiarity with the terrain and a working understanding of what the cartel operations in western Mexico actually looked like from the air. His life outside the cockpit is not something the public record illuminates in much detail. He was not a famous man. He left behind no memoir and gave no lengthy interviews. He appears in the historical record the way that many essential people do, through what he did, rather than through what he said about himself. What the record does establish is that he was a competent, experienced professional who had been participating in legitimate government anti-narcotics programs for years before his path converged with the people who would eventually order his death. He was not reckless. He was not an infiltrator trying to build a case by embedding himself inside a criminal organization. He flew government aircraft for government programs, took photographs when photographs were needed, and reported what he found to the officials who had tasked him with finding it. That was his role, and for a long time, it seemed to be something he could do without putting himself in extraordinary danger. In 1983, the DEA agent in charge of the Guadalajara resident office, James Kuykendall, came to Zavala with a set of aerial photographs that had made their way to the agency's attention. Kuykendall wanted to understand them, what they showed, when they had been taken, what the scale of the operation in the images actually suggested. Zavala looked at the photographs and told Kuykendall something that shifted the DEA's understanding of the problem in front of them. He had taken those photographs himself during his own government missions, but they were already a year old. Whatever had been growing there when the images were captured had very likely expanded and evolved significantly in the time since. That gap between the photographic record and current reality mattered enormously, because the DEA agents working in Guadalajara were already suspicious that official accounts of cartel operations were drastically understating the scale of what was happening. Zavala's confirmation of how old those images were added weight to the argument that another agent in the Guadalajara office, Enrique Camarena, had been making insistently for months. By 1984, Zavala and Camarena were working together directly. The DEA agent had spent years carefully developing a network of informants across western Mexico, and that network had begun producing intelligence pointing to a specific area of the state of Chihuahua as the site of something significantly larger than anything the agency had previously documented. Camarena needed eyes from the air to confirm what his ground-level informants were describing, and Zavala was the pilot who flew those confirmation passes. What they found was a marijuana plantation called Rancho Buffalo, stretching across approximately 2,500 acres of cultivated land, large enough to employ hundreds of workers and significant enough to generate an estimated $8 billion annually for the men who controlled it. From the cockpit, Zavala held the aircraft steady while Camarena photographed what they were looking at: a massive industrial operation hidden in the mountains of Chihuahua, belonging to the three men who controlled the Guadalajara cartel: Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. The photographs they brought back were among the most significant pieces of intelligence the DEA had gathered in years. In November 1984, acting on what Camarena's network and Zavala's aerial work had established, 450 Mexican soldiers, backed by helicopters, descended on the Rancho Buffalo area and destroyed the plantation. More than 10,000 tons of marijuana was burned. The financial damage to the cartel was catastrophic. The three men who had built and financed Rancho Buffalo over years had also invested heavily in the political and law enforcement protection that was supposed to make operations of that scale untouchable. Corrupt officials at multiple levels of the Mexican government had been paid to stay quiet and keep others quiet. All of that protection had failed, and the men who had paid for it knew exactly who to blame. The cartel had its own intelligence sources inside the Mexican government through the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, the country's main domestic intelligence agency, whose leadership had deep ties to organized crime. Cartel figures were able to compile information on the people whose work had made the Rancho Buffalo raid possible. Camarena was the most visible target, an American DEA agent whose name and presence in Guadalajara was known, whose informant network had generated the intelligence that triggered the raid, and whose removal would send a message about what happened to federal law enforcement personnel who disrupted cartel operations on that scale. But Zavala was also identified. He was the pilot who had flown the reconnaissance passes. He had taken the photographs from the air. In the cartel's accounting of responsibility for their losses, his name sat alongside Camarena's in a way that made him a target just as deliberate and just as planned. In September 1984, according to testimony later given in federal proceedings in the United States, senior cartel figures gathered at a meeting at the home of an associate and reached a collective decision. Someone from the DEA needed to be seized. They agreed on a specific name. What was not part of the public discussion at that meeting, but became apparent through what happened on February 7th, 1985, is that the pilot, who had flown with that agent, was also on the list. The two kidnappings that afternoon were coordinated. They happened within the same narrow window of time and required multiple teams of men and a level of surveillance and planning that would have been impossible without the involvement of corrupt government officials who could provide intelligence on the movements and routines of both targets. Camarena was taken outside the American consulate building in Guadalajara around 2 in the afternoon, grabbed by men who had been waiting for him. Zavala was taken separately, near the Guadalajara airport, at approximately the same time. The precise circumstances of his abduction near the airport, the exact moment, and the exact number of men involved are details the public record does not lay out with great precision. What it does establish is that the kidnapping was planned, deliberate, and coordinated with the other one happening across the city at roughly the same hour. This was not a case of Zavala being swept up accidentally in a net that was meant only for Camarena. The men who took him knew who he was, knew what he had done, and had decided in advance that he would be taken on the same afternoon and delivered to the same destination. That destination was a house at 881 Lope de Vega in the colonia of Jardines del Bosque, a property that belonged to Caro Quintero. Inside that house, the interrogation of both men began. The session lasted more than 30 hours, and the nature of what happened during those hours has been established through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony from people who were in or near the property during that period, and an audio recording that exists from part of the interrogation. The cartel wanted information, what the DEA knew about their operations beyond what had already been acted on, who inside Mexico had been talking, how much had been communicated to Washington, what other investigations were in progress. Camarena was subjected to severe and sustained physical violence during this period. The injuries documented by forensic investigators afterward included crushed facial bones, broken ribs, a punctured skull, and damage to the windpipe. A doctor was reportedly brought to the house at some point during the session to administer injections intended to keep Camarena conscious so the questioning could continue. Zavala's experience inside that house differed in one specific and important way from Camarena's, and not in a way that made it more bearable. Accounts that emerged from the investigation suggest that while Camarena was given minimal sustenance, some basic level of care aimed at keeping him alive for further interrogation, Zavala received nothing. No food, no water, no medical intervention. The cartel's interest in Camarena was extensive. He was an intelligence source who might know a great deal about ongoing DEA operations and informant networks. Zavala's value in that sense was more limited. He had been the pilot. He had flown the passes and taken the photographs. There was less to extract from him in terms of ongoing DEA strategy and personnel, and the treatment he received during those hours reflected that calculation. At some point during the interrogation, according to accounts that emerged through testimony in later proceedings, Camarena spoke up for Zavala. He reportedly told the men interrogating them that the pilot was innocent of intelligence work, that the blame for the Rancho Buffalo raid should rest on Camarena himself, and not on the man who had simply operated the aircraft. The cartel did not accept that argument. Both men remained in the house. Both men died at some point around February 9th, 2 days after being taken. The exact sequence of events in the final hours remains partially disputed, and the specific individuals who delivered the fatal injuries have never been fully established beyond what the legal proceedings against cartel leaders eventually determined. What is established is that both deaths occurred at that Guadalajara property within that approximate window of time, and that both bodies were then buried rather than left in place. The initial burial site was somewhere near Guadalajara, in the general area of a large nature reserve to the west of the city called the Bosque de la Primavera. At some point in the weeks that followed, before discovery, the bodies were moved. The cartel exhumed them from their original location and transported them across the state border into Michoacán, where they were reburied in a rural field near a ranch in a remote area roughly 60 to 75 miles southeast of Guadalajara. On March 5, 1985, they were found. Both were wrapped in plastic sheeting, blindfolded, bound at the wrists, and gagged. Forensic examination confirmed extensive injuries to both and established that both had died from blows to the head and neck. Their bodies had been buried together, found together, and identified together, just as they had been taken together, on the same afternoon, from different points in the same city. The investigation that followed, which the DEA named Operation Leyenda, became the largest homicide inquiry the agency had ever undertaken at that point in its history. Its political weight in the United States derived primarily from the killing of Camarena, whose murder as an American federal agent on foreign soil generated immediate pressure from Washington on the Mexican government to act. That pressure produced results. Caro Quintero and Fonseca Carrillo were arrested in April 1985. Felix Gallardo avoided arrest until 1989. All three were eventually convicted in Mexican courts for their roles in the events of February 1985, and the convictions named both victims. The trial record includes Zavala, alongside Camarena, as someone who was taken, held, tortured, and murdered by the same organization, acting on the same orders. The legal process connected to these events has continued for 4 decades. Caro Quintero, released by a Mexican court on a legal technicality in 2013 and recaptured in 2022, was extradited to the United States in February 2025. He is currently awaiting federal trial in Brooklyn, facing charges that include the conspiracy that produced both killings. Fonseca Carrillo, by the time his Mexican sentence ran out in April 2025, had reached his 90s and was released from custody in Mexico. The Camarena family's civil lawsuit, filed in 2025 against the Sinaloa Cartel and 3 suspected kingpins, names Zavala alongside Camarena as a victim of the same conspiracy, which is an accurate and fair accounting of what the evidence shows. What the lawsuit and the legal record cannot fully repair is the disparity in how these 2 deaths have been remembered. Camarena has a federal law bearing his name, a national drug prevention awareness campaign launched in his honor, schools in his home community that teach his story, and a Netflix series depicting his career. Zavala has an entry in the legal filings and a mention in accounts that almost always move on from his name within a sentence or 2. That disparity is not primarily a reflection of which man suffered more or which death was more significant. It is a reflection of the fact that one of them was an American federal agent and the other was a Mexican government pilot. The structural difference in how those 2 categories of person are remembered by American institutions, American media, and American audiences has shaped the historical record in a way that understates what Zavala actually did and what it cost him. He flew the passes over Rancho Buffalo. He held the aircraft steady while the photographs were taken. He confirmed for DEA investigators that the aerial record they were looking at was already outdated, and he understood what that meant for the scale of the operation the cartel was running. He participated in the work that made the November 1984 raid possible, and the men who lost everything in that raid identified him as someone who needed to be held accountable for it. They were correct that he had participated. He had. And on February 7th, 1985, on the same afternoon that a DEA agent with 3 young sons was taken off a Guadalajara street on his way to meet his wife for lunch, Alfredo Zavala Avila was taken from near an airport in the same city, brought to the same house, and killed in the same sequence of events that history has largely narrated without him at its center. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Zavala was killed because the cartel knew exactly who he was, the next 2 men on this list were killed for the opposite reason. They were tourists who sat down to dinner at a Guadalajara restaurant in January 1985, and a room full of armed cartel members decided, without any evidence at all, that they had to be DEA informants. Section 2. John Walker and Alberto Radalat. On the evening of January 30th, 1985, 8 days before Enrique Camarena would be taken off a Guadalajara street, 2 men walked into a restaurant called La Langosta and made the worst decision of their lives without knowing there was a decision being made at all. They had not chosen the restaurant because it was significant, or because they had any reason to believe that a room full of cartel members had already been drinking inside it for hours. They chose it the way people choose restaurants, because it was there, because the evening called for something good to eat, and because nothing about the street outside suggested that anything happening inside would be out of the ordinary. They were wrong about all of that. Within hours, both of them were dead. John Walker was an American who had come to Guadalajara to write. He had been living in the city for a stretch of time, working on a novel, building the kind of slower, quieter daily life that writers sometimes seek in foreign cities when the noise of their home country becomes too much to work through. Guadalajara was a reasonable choice for that kind of life in the mid-1980s. It was Mexico's second largest city, a place with a genuine cultural identity of its own, distinct from Mexico City in its pace and character, with a large expatriate community that gave foreign residents a social world they could inhabit without being entirely isolated. The city had a reputation for good food, for music, for a colonial architecture that made certain neighborhoods genuinely beautiful at certain hours of the day. What it also had, though this was not something that figured prominently in the experience of most of the foreigners living there, was a cartel. The Guadalajara cartel controlled drug trafficking in the region, had done so for years, and had become extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily paranoid in the months leading up to that January evening. The paranoia had a specific source. In November 1984, 2 months before Walker and his friend would walk into La Langosta, Mexican soldiers had descended on a marijuana plantation called Rancho Buffalo in the state of Chihuahua and destroyed it. The plantation was among the largest drug-growing operations ever discovered in North America, covering roughly 2,500 acres and producing marijuana at a scale that generated billions of dollars annually for the 3 men who ran the Guadalajara cartel: Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. The raid had cost them an enormous amount, not just in marijuana but in the infrastructure, the workforce, the years of cultivation, and the political arrangements they had paid to keep the operation safe. They had been paying corrupt government officials for protection, and that protection had failed. The plantation had been found and burned. Whoever had found it had done so because someone had talked. That conviction, that a leak was responsible, was the operating premise inside the cartel's inner circle by January 1985. The men who led the organization and the people who worked closely with them had become consumed by the question of who was responsible, who had been talking to American law enforcement, who had provided the information that made the raid possible. This was not an abstract or philosophical anxiety. It was the kind of fear that produces concrete and violent outcomes, the kind of suspicion that, in a world where the cartel's response to perceived betrayal was summary execution, made everyone in the orbit of these men perpetually vulnerable to being identified as the source of the problem. DEA informants were everywhere in the cartel's imagination, even when they were not present in reality. And by late January 1985, the men running the Guadalajara cartel were looking for them around every corner. Alberto Radalat was visiting Walker in Guadalajara. He was a friend making a trip, the kind of visit that happens in a friendship where one person has relocated abroad and the other comes to see how the new life is going. Radalat was Cuban-American, a young man in the same general stage of life as Walker, someone with no connection whatsoever to American law enforcement or to the drug war that was playing out in the city and the mountains around them. The 2 men did not work for the DEA. They did not work for any government agency with a mandate touching on narcotics. They did not have informant relationships with American agents stationed in Mexico. They were 2 people who knew each other and had made plans to spend time together in a city that one of them had adopted as a temporary home. And on the evening of January 30th, those plans included going out to eat. La Langosta was a seafood restaurant in Guadalajara. On that particular evening, a section of the restaurant had been cleared, specifically to accommodate a private gathering of between 10 and 15 men who were affiliated with the Guadalajara cartel. Fonseca Carrillo, one of the 3 principal leaders of the cartel, was among those present or closely associated with the gathering's arrangements. The group had been there for a significant period of time before Walker and Radalat arrived. They had been drinking. The combination of alcohol, the atmosphere of paranoia that had settled over the cartel's inner circle in the weeks since Rancho Buffalo, and the simple fact of 2 American men walking through the door of a restaurant where a group of armed cartel members had been sitting for hours, produced the outcome that it produced. Someone in that group decided that Walker and Radalat were not what they appeared to be. The specific logic of that decision, if it can be called logic, is not something the historical record preserves in great detail. What the investigation that followed was able to establish is that the two men were identified by someone in the gathering as potential DEA informants or possibly undercover agents. The word for spy and the word for informant in that context were functionally interchangeable. These were Americans who had come into a room where cartel members were drinking and making business, and there was, in the fevered internal atmosphere of January 1985, no innocent explanation for that. The fact that the innocent explanation was in fact the true one did not matter, because the men making the decision were not interested in establishing the truth. They were interested in protecting themselves from what they feared, and what they feared had taken on the shape of every American they encountered. Walker and Radelat were grabbed. The accounts that eventually emerged through the investigation and the legal proceedings connected to the Camarena case describe what happened next in terms that are not difficult to understand, but are very difficult to sit with. Both men were beaten. Fists and weapons were used. They were struck repeatedly by multiple people in the main part of the restaurant, and then they were dragged into a back room, a storage area, away from the public sections of the space, where the beating continued. They were being held in that room while the men who had taken them tried to extract some kind of confirmation that they were who they had been assumed to be. The interrogation happening in that storage room was not sophisticated. It was frightened men with weapons asking questions of people who had no useful answers to give, and continuing to hurt those people when the answers did not come back in the form they wanted. At some point during this, one of the two men, in pain, terrified, trying to find something that would make the violence stop, said something that the people in that room interpreted as a confession. The specific nature of what was said has been described in the legal record in a way that amounts to this. Under extreme duress, with no other apparent way out of the room, one of the two men said something that sounded like an acknowledgement that they were connected to police. It was not true. There was nothing true about it. It was the statement of a desperate person trying to say whatever the people hurting him seemed to want to hear, a calculation made in the middle of a beating rather than a disclosure of actual fact. But the men in that room did not understand it that way, or did not choose to understand it that way. They heard what they had been looking for, or something close enough to it to serve the same purpose. The decision that followed was made quickly. Walker and Radelat were moved out of the restaurant under the control of the men who had been holding them. The timeline that the investigation later reconstructed places their removal from La Langosta in the evening hours of January 30th, with a drive that took them out of the city and into the rural areas beyond its edges. The specific location where the final events took place was a field outside Guadalajara, a place with no witnesses, no ambient noise from the city, no one to hear anything or ask questions about what was happening in the dark. Both men were killed there. The investigation was never able to establish with precision every detail of how this happened, but the forensic evidence gathered when the bodies were eventually found, combined with testimony from people who were connected to the cartel's activities during that period, established that both deaths were intentional and that they occurred at approximately that time and location. Their bodies were not found in January. The disappearance of two Americans in Guadalajara registered with the consulate and with American authorities, but without bodies, without a crime scene, without anyone willing to come forward with information, there was no path to resolution in the short term. The city was a place where people who asked the wrong questions about the wrong subjects found that no one had helpful answers. The cartel had reach inside the police, inside local government, inside the networks of people who might otherwise have passed on information. Walker had been living his expatriate life quietly. Radelat had been visiting. Neither of them had made enemies. Neither of them had a profile that made their disappearance anything other than deeply confusing to the people who had known them and to the officials who were nominally responsible for investigating it. Their bodies were discovered in June 1985, 4 months after they were killed. By that point, the Camarena investigation was already underway. Camarena and his pilot Alfredo Zavala had been taken in February, their bodies found in March, and the full weight of American diplomatic and investigative pressure was beginning to reshape what Mexican authorities were able or willing to do about cartel violence in Guadalajara and the surrounding state of Jalisco. In that changed environment, with American investigators on the ground and an Operation Leyenda inquiry generating sustained pressure on everyone connected to the cartel's operations, the circumstances that had allowed Walker and Radelat's disappearance to sit unresolved for months began to shift. The discovery of their bodies in June allowed investigators to bring the two killings into the same legal framework that was being assembled around Camarena's murder. The connection between the two cases was established through the investigation and eventually through trial. The men who grabbed and beat Walker and Radelat at La Langosta were affiliated with the same cartel organization that had ordered Camarena's kidnapping. The logic underlying both attacks was the same: a group of men who were desperately afraid that DEA informants had penetrated their operations, lashing out at anyone who fit their distorted picture of what a threat looked like. Camarena was killed because he actually was a DEA agent who had built the informant network that led to Rancho Bufalo's discovery. Walker and Radelat were killed because they were American, because they walked into the wrong room on the wrong night, and because the men who grabbed them had lost the capacity to distinguish between a real threat and an imaginary one in the fog of alcohol and paranoia that surrounded them on that particular evening. When the trials connected to Camarena's murder were eventually held in Los Angeles, the Walker and Radelat killings were folded into the same proceedings. Javier Vázquez Velasco, one of the defendants, was convicted specifically on 2 counts connected to his role in the deaths of Walker and Radelat. The prosecutors argued successfully that both sets of killings were part of the same pattern of cartel violence against people suspected of connection to the DEA, and the courts agreed, ruling that American law could reach crimes committed entirely on Mexican soil when those crimes were direct attacks on American drug enforcement efforts and, by extension, on American national security. Vázquez Velasco received 2 consecutive life sentences on May 23, 1991, with the Walker and Radelat killings forming a significant part of the basis for that outcome. What those 2 men have never received in the 40 years since they died in a field outside Guadalajara is a level of public attention that comes close to matching the scale of the injustice done to them. The Camarena case generated congressional hearings, changed federal law, inspired a national drug prevention campaign, and produced a Netflix series. Walker and Radelat produced a pair of entries in court documents and a few paragraphs in accounts of a larger story they were never actually part of. They were not informants. They had no connection to the drug war. They had no relationship with the DEA, and no knowledge that would have been of any interest to the cartel if the men who grabbed them had possessed even the most basic capacity for rational assessment. They were a writer and his friend who had chosen a restaurant, and that choice had put them in a room with people who had convinced themselves that every American face they saw in Guadalajara in January 1985 was a threat to be eliminated. The cartel killed them for information they did not have, under the assumption of a role they were not playing, in service of a paranoia that had completely lost its connection to the real. John Walker and Alberto Radelat were the first people the Guadalajara cartel killed in the sequence of events that would also take Alfredo Zavala and Enrique Camarena. They died a week before Camarena, in the same city, under the same cloud of fear and violence that had settled over the cartel's inner circle after Rancho Bufalo. Their killings were not footnotes to what came later. They were the opening act of a terror that the cartel turned on anyone it could reach, whether those people were DEA informants or not. And in the case of Walker and Radelat, they were not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Walker and Radelat were killed because the cartel decided to assume the worst without any real evidence, the next man on this list gave the cartel every reason to want him dead. He was a pilot who had worked for them for years, moving cocaine by the ton out of South America, until the day he was arrested in Florida and decided that cooperating with the government was a better option than going to prison. The Medellin cartel put a $500,000 bounty on his head, and for 2 years, he managed to stay alive. Then, a single newspaper story changed everything. Section 3. Barry Seal Adler. Berryman Seal was born on July 16, 1939, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the son of a candy wholesaler, and he learned to fly before he was old enough to vote. He earned his student pilot certificate at 16 and his private certificate at 17, and the skill came to him with the kind of natural ease that made flight instructors take notice and remember him years later. By the time he was in his 20s, he was flying commercially for TWA, a career that should have been enough, but Seal was not a man who found enough in things that were enough. He had a restlessness that commercial aviation did not satisfy, a taste for the edge of acceptable risk that legitimate flying could not fully feed, and over the course of the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, he found his way into work that fed it completely. He became one of the most prolific drug smugglers in American history, flying cocaine and marijuana for the Medellin cartel out of Colombia and into the United States, using modified aircraft to carry loads that would have been impossible for anyone less skilled to move safely, landing on improvised airstrips in Louisiana's Bayou country with tons of product aboard and walking away clean. At the height of his smuggling career, Seal was earning extraordinary sums. He had houses, boats, aircraft of his own, the full material signature of a man who had solved the problem of money so completely that it had stopped being a problem. He flew multiple missions weekly at peak periods, earning up to $1 million per flight, and he moved through the networks of the Medellin cartel with the confidence of someone who knew himself to be genuinely irreplaceable. The cartel needed pilots of his caliber badly. Moving product in the quantities that Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, and their partners were moving into the United States required men who could fly long distances at low altitude, navigate without filing plans, and put an overloaded plane down on a strip of grass or gravel in the dark without killing everyone aboard. Seal could do all of that, and the cartel paid him accordingly. The arrangement held until 1983, when a Drug Enforcement Administration sting operation called Operation Screamer caught up with him in Florida. He was arrested on drug trafficking charges that carried the prospect of a very long prison sentence, and the calculation he faced after his arrest was straightforward in its structure, if not in its execution. He had information the DEA wanted badly. He had direct access to the Ochoa family and to Pablo Escobar himself, relationships built over years of working closely with some of the most significant drug trafficking figures in the world. What he was offering, if he chose to cooperate, was not the low-level intelligence of a peripheral figure, but the kind of access that could potentially bring major indictments against the cartel's actual leadership. The DEA recognized this, and Seal recognized that they recognized it, and in March 1984, he signed an agreement to become a federal informant. The South Florida Task Force, which handled drug interdiction under the oversight of then Vice President George H.W. Bush's office, became the lead American authority managing Seal's cooperation. DEA agent Ernst Jacobson was assigned to debrief him and evaluate his potential, and Jacobson's assessment was straightforwardly enthusiastic. Seal's connections, especially those with the Ochoa family, were unusually deep. He was given a cover identity he had already been using in his smuggling work, the name Ellis Mackenzie, and through his cartel contacts, he arranged to fly back to Medellin for a meeting in April 1984. He was one of the very few American informants who could have made that trip and been welcomed rather than searched. What came out of that operation went far beyond the original intelligence mandate. SEAL was equipped with a modified C-123 cargo plane fitted with hidden cameras, and in the course of a sting that the DEA had designed to generate evidence against cartel figures, he managed to capture something that became politically enormous: photographs of Nicaraguan government officials, specifically a man named Federico Vaughan, who served as an aide to a senior Nicaraguan minister, loading cocaine onto his aircraft. The Reagan administration had been working to build a public case that the Sandinista government of Nicaragua was complicit in drug trafficking, and SEAL's photographs were treated as evidence for that argument. The images were shared at the highest levels of the American government, and eventually, despite objections from the DEA and from federal prosecutors who were worried about the consequences, they were leaked to the press. A front-page story in the Washington Times in July 1984 essentially identified SEAL as a government agent. The byline named him. The story used enough specific detail that anyone in the Medellin cartel who read it, or had it read to them, could connect the Ellis Mackenzie who had been flying missions for them to the man now identified in an American newspaper as a federal informant whose photographs were being used by the Reagan administration to embarrass a foreign government. The DEA had fought against the leak. Federal prosecutors had fought against it. They understood exactly what it meant for SEAL's safety, and their objections had been overridden by political considerations that had nothing to do with the welfare of the man whose cover had just been destroyed in print. Once the story was out, SEAL's usefulness as an active undercover asset effectively ended. Max Mermelstein, a high-level cartel distributor operating out of Miami, who had been one of SEAL's contacts and who would later himself cooperate with the government, testified in court that he was shown the newspaper article within days of its publication. He was then approached about a contract. The cartel wanted SEAL, and they were willing to pay for it. The terms Mermelstein described in testimony were $500,000 for SEAL's death, and $1 million if he could be captured alive and brought to Colombia. Mermelstein accepted the contract, but was arrested by a federal task force in June 1985 before he could act on it. He told the task force about the contract's existence, and SEAL was informed that the cartel had put a price on his head. That information presented SEAL with a choice about his own life that most people will never have to make. The U.S. Marshals Service, which administers the Federal Witness Protection Program, made the program available to him. Relocation, a new identity, a new life in a new place. The infrastructure that exists specifically for people in exactly his situation. A high-value cooperator with powerful criminal enemies and a confirmed bounty on his life. SEAL declined. He told the people around him that he was not worried about the contract, that he was capable of taking care of himself, that the cartel's ability to reach him in Louisiana was limited enough that the threat did not require the response the marshals were offering. Those who knew him well and wrote about him later described a man who had been operating at the edge of fatal risk for so long that he had developed a kind of philosophical indifference to it, an understanding that the danger was real, but an inability to treat it with the urgency that its reality deserved. His legal situation was also working against him. Despite his cooperation, he faced ongoing charges in Louisiana, where the U.S. Attorney's Office had prepared a drug kingpin case that was largely independent of the Florida matter. The resolution of that case resulted in a sentence of 6 months at a Salvation Army Community Treatment Center on Airline Highway in Baton Rouge, a halfway house arrangement that put him in a specific, public, fixed location every evening. He was required to check in and sleep there. The location was known, the schedule was regular, and the building was not a fortress. It was a halfway house on a commercial strip in his hometown, and he was there every night. By early 1986, the cartel had reorganized its efforts to find him. Luis Carlos Uribe Munera, a Colombian drug trafficker with connections to Jorge Ochoa, later testified in court that in January 1986, he received an order from Ochoa directly, find Seal and kill him. 3 Colombian nationals were identified as the men eventually dispatched to carry out the operation. Their names were Miguel Velez, Luis Carlos Quintero Cruz, and Bernardo Antonio Vasquez. They traveled to Baton Rouge and established surveillance on the Salvation Army facility on Airline Highway, learning the pattern of Seal's arrivals and departures. They identified the vehicle he drove to and from the facility, a white Cadillac. They confirmed his schedule, and on the evening of February 19, 1986, they positioned themselves in the parking lot and waited. Seal arrived in his Cadillac and pulled into the parking lot. One of the 3 men approached the driver's side of the car, carrying a MAC-10 machine pistol. The weapon was fired in 2 bursts at close range through the car window. Seal was struck multiple times in the head and upper body. He was 46 years old. The wounds were unsurvivable, and he died at the scene, sitting in the driver's seat of his car in a parking lot on a busy commercial road in the city where he had been born. The local police who responded to the scene found a Colombians nearby who had not managed to flee quickly enough, and the investigation that followed was immediate and extensive. One of those initially detained, a man named Jose Renteria, was carrying a camera, and the photographs on his film were described by investigators as images of Seal's body taken in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. An FBI agent confiscated the camera at the New Orleans airport when Renteria was being processed, and the film was reportedly exposed, destroying the images. The circumstances surrounding that specific detail became one of many points of contention in the long aftermath of the killing, with various parties and investigators raising questions about exactly what had happened and why. Renteria himself was not charged with the murder and was eventually deported. The 3 men identified as the gunmen, Velez, Quintero Cruz, and Vasquez, were all indicted by an East Baton Rouge grand jury and charged with first-degree murder. Because of the extraordinary level of public attention the case had generated in Louisiana, the trial was moved out of Baton Rouge to Lake Charles, where the court felt it was possible to seat a jury that had not been saturated by media coverage of the case. The trial began in April 1987, more than a year after the killing. The prosecution built its case through testimony from Mermelstein and Uribe Munera, both of whom had direct knowledge of the contract and its origins within the Medellin cartel's leadership. Mermelstein described being shown the newspaper article identifying Seal as a government agent, being approached about the contract, and being given money and weapons to carry out the job. Uribe Munera described the January 1986 order from Jorge Ochoa to locate and kill Seal. All 3 defendants were convicted of first-degree murder. Each received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Pablo Escobar, Jorge Ochoa, and Rafael Cardona Salazar were named as co-conspirators in the Louisiana state murder case, but were never extradited to face those charges. A separate federal indictment in the Middle District of Louisiana charged the 3 cartel bosses with conspiring to orchestrate Seal's death. But legal and political complications surrounding extradition from Colombia prevented any of those charges from being prosecuted against the men who ordered the killing. Cardona Salazar was killed in an ambush in Colombia in December 1987. Escobar was killed by Colombian National Police during a rooftop chase in Medellin in December 1993. Jorge Ochoa was arrested and eventually extradited to the United States in 2001, but the conditions of his extradition agreement prevented prosecution for crimes that occurred before Colombia, and the United States resumed extraditions in 1997, which meant the Seal murder charges were effectively off the table. He was prosecuted only for the drug trafficking offenses covered by the 2001 agreement, convicted and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He was released in December 2024 after completing his sentence and deported to Colombia. Fabio Ochoa Vasquez, Jorge's brother, who prosecutors alleged was also involved in organizing the contract on Seal's life, was extradited to the United States in 2001 as well, and faced similar restrictions on what he could be charged with. He served 25 years of a 30-year drug trafficking sentence and was released in late 2024. Neither brother ever stood trial specifically for what happened in that parking lot in Baton Rouge on February 19, 1986. What Seal left behind, apart from the legal proceedings and the political questions that have swirled around his case for decades, was a record of cooperation that federal officials described in terms that still stand as remarkable, even measured against the full history of DEA informant work. A prosecutor involved in the Medellin cartel cases described him as the most important witness in the history of American drug enforcement. That description carries the weight it carries because of what Seal was able to do that almost no one else could. He had genuine, trusted relationships with the actual leaders of the cartel, relationships built over years of dependable work, and those relationships had given him access to information and operations that no undercover agent working from the outside could have replicated. His cooperation generated major indictments, contributed to cases that resulted in significant prosecutions, and produced documentary evidence, specifically those photographs from Managua, that shaped policy debates at the highest levels of government. What it did not produce was adequate protection for the man who had provided it. The leak that destroyed his cover, the failure to relocate him into witness protection, the court order that placed him on a fixed schedule at a publicly known address in his hometown, these things taken together created the conditions that made his death possible. The cartel needed only to know where he would be and when, and the American legal system had answered both of those questions for them. Barry Seal died in a parking lot at 46 years old, in the city he had grown up in, within a mile or two of places he had known his whole life. The three men who killed him served their life sentences in Louisiana. The men who ordered the killing died in Colombia without ever facing an American courtroom for that specific crime. The newspaper story that destroyed his cover was never the subject of any formal accountability, and the $500,000 bounty that was put on his head remained one of the more striking measures of how seriously the Medellin cartel took the work he had done against them, a number large enough in 1984 to suggest that the cartel understood exactly what they had lost when the man they had trusted to fly their cocaine had turned around and told the Americans everything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Barry Seal was killed in his home country, shot in a parking lot by men who had traveled from Colombia specifically to find him, the next case moves to American soil in a different way. A cartel lieutenant who had secretly become a government informant was shot 8 times in front of his own house on a quiet cul-de-sac in El Paso, Texas, by a United States Army soldier who had been hired for the job by the very organization the man was supposed to be helping bring down. Section 4. José Daniel González Galeana. José Daniel González Galeana was 37 years old and living a life that looked, from the outside, like the life of a successful immigrant who had made it in America. He had a 2-story home on a cul-de-sac in an expensive neighborhood in El Paso, Texas, a quiet street in a city that sits directly across the Rio Grande from Ciudad Juárez. His neighbors knew him as a pleasant, low-key presence. The families around him had no particular reason to look at his house and wonder about what was happening inside it. Children played together in the street. People waved when they passed each other. The El Paso police chief, Greg Allen, lived in a house directly behind González Galeana's, close enough to hear sounds from the front yard through the back fence, and he had no idea what his neighbor actually was until the morning he heard gunshots and came outside to find a crime scene. What González Galeana actually was complicated in a way that the public record only partially resolves. He was a lieutenant in the Juárez Cartel, a mid-level commander in the organization that had once been one of the most powerful drug trafficking operations in Mexico. controlling the corridor that ran through Ciudad Juarez and into Texas, and carrying billions of dollars of cocaine, heroin, and marijuana north annually. His specific role within the cartel involved overseeing smuggling operations, coordinating the movement of product across the border, and the distribution networks that received it on the American side. He was not a low-level figure. He was a man with real authority inside a real criminal organization, someone who knew enough about how the Juarez cartel operated to be genuinely valuable to the people above him. He was also, according to 3 U.S. officials who confirmed his status to the Associated Press on condition of anonymity, a confidential informant working for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The exact timeline of when he began cooperating with ICE and what specifically triggered that cooperation has never been made fully public. What is established is that by May 2009, González Galeana was providing information about cartel activities to American federal agents while simultaneously maintaining his position within the cartel's structure. The arrangement, which is common in organized crime investigations but carries obvious and serious risks, required him to keep 2 entirely separate realities running in parallel: the world of people who trusted him as a cartel lieutenant and the world of federal agents who trusted him as an informant. Maintaining that kind of double existence indefinitely is extraordinarily difficult, and the history of such arrangements is full of cases where the balance eventually tips. Within the Juarez cartel, suspicion about González Galeana had begun to build before May 2009. According to the charging documents filed after his murder, the cartel had concluded that he was either passing information to federal authorities or had shifted his loyalties to a rival organization. The specific intelligence that produced that suspicion is not detailed in public records, but the outcome of the suspicion is documented clearly. The cartel decided he needed to be killed, and they assigned the job to a man named Ruben Rodriguez Dorado. Rodriguez Dorado was 30 years old, a mid-level Juarez cartel member whose role, as he later described it himself to El Paso investigators, involved tracking people. He told police that his assignment for the cartel was to conduct surveillance on targets, following them and monitoring their movements until the timing was right for whatever the cartel intended to do next. He had been tasked with locating González Galeana and confirming his whereabouts consistently enough that a killing could be arranged. What made this particular situation unusual, and what added a layer of bitter irony to it that the investigators involved could not have missed, was that Rodriguez Dorado was himself a confidential informant for ICE. Both the man being hunted and the man doing the hunting were on the American government's payroll at the same time. The cartel had used one of its cooperating witnesses to find and facilitate the killing of another. For the actual shooting, Rodriguez Dorado contracted out. He recruited 2 men, Christopher Duran, who was 17 years old, and PFC, Michael Jackson Apodaca, who was 18 and stationed at Fort Bliss, the large army base just outside El Paso. Apodaca was an active-duty United States Army soldier. The decision to hire a soldier for a cartel killing was not random. Young men at Fort Bliss lived near the border. Some had grown up in El Paso and had existing connections to people on both sides of it, and the cartel had developed a pattern in that period of recruiting military personnel for contract work that required someone willing to use a weapon and capable of handling the physical reality of doing so. On the morning of May 15, 2009, González Galeana was outside his home on the cul-de-sac when Apodaca shot him. He was hit 8 times. The shots were fired at close range, and the grouping and deliberateness of the wounds left no ambiguity about intent. 8 bullets meant that whoever had fired them had wanted to make certain the job was finished. Police Chief Allen, in his house directly behind, heard the shots from his backyard. By the time he was outside and around to the front of González Galeana's property, his neighbor was already dying on the ground in front of a house on a quiet street in one of El Paso's nicer neighborhoods. The street where this happened was a residential cul-de-sac in a city that had a reputation, then as now, as one of the safer large cities in America. El Paso investigators worked the case through the summer of 2009, and by early August, they had built enough of a picture to move. Rodriguez Dorado, Duran, and Apodaca were arrested on August 10th. Apodaca told investigators directly that he had fired the shots. He described being hired through Rodriguez Dorado and receiving payment for the killing, though the specific amount paid was not made public in the initial reporting on the arrests. All three were charged with capital murder and held on $1 million bond each. The charges against Apodaca raised immediate and uncomfortable questions about the military's awareness of what was happening with personnel stationed at a base on the US-Mexico border. Fort Bliss issued a statement confirming Apodaca's assignment there and indicated the Army was cooperating with the investigation, but the broader question of how a cartel had successfully recruited an active duty soldier to carry out a contract killing in an American city was not one that any official body moved quickly to answer in public. A fourth person was arrested shortly afterward, a 16-year-old boy whose name was not released because of his age. He was charged with capital murder as well, on the basis of his alleged involvement in the planning and coordination of the attack. González Galeana's murder drew significant attention from law enforcement analysts and border security experts, not primarily because of its specific details, but because of what it represented in a broader pattern. Experts consulted by the Associated Press in the weeks after the killing described it as likely the first instance of cartel assassins killing a ranking cartel member on American soil. Drug cartels had for years disciplined low-level dealers in the United States, had intimidated distributors, had used violence to settle disputes within their American distribution networks. But the killing of a lieutenant-level figure in a suburban neighborhood in Texas, arranged by cartel leadership in Mexico and carried out by a hired American soldier, was understood at the time as a crossing of a line that law enforcement had been watching nervously for years. Chief Allen, in his public statements after the arrest, said his department had been operating on the assumption from the beginning that González Galeana had been killed in retaliation for his role as an informant, and that the shooting was connected to the cartel's internal enforcement of loyalty. He was also notably and publicly angry that he had not been briefed by federal authorities about the fact that an active informant with known cartel affiliations was living directly behind his own house. That conversation about how much local law enforcement should know when federal agencies are running informants in their jurisdictions is one that has continued in various forms since long before this case and has not been resolved by it. The outcome of the legal proceedings against the three principal defendants unfolded over the following years in the Texas court system. Apodaca, who had admitted to being the triggerman, eventually pleaded guilty to murder and received a sentence of 25 years in prison. The cases against Rodriguez Dorado and Duran moved through the courts separately. González Galeana's death is recorded in the El Paso court system, in the federal records of the IC Informant program, and in the investigative files of a cartel that apparently never knew or did not care that the man whose death it arranged had been on the American government's payroll at the same time as the man it used to arrange that death. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the killing of González Galeana played out on a residential street in broad daylight, the next case on this list took place at a coffee shop table in Mexico City in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, when two men in business suits walked in and shot a protected government witness dead before anyone in the room had time to understand what was happening. Section 5. Edgar Enrique Bayardo del Villar. Edgar Enrique Bayardo del Villar had spent his career inside Mexico's federal police in the way that many people spend careers inside deeply compromised institutions, doing some version of the job while also doing something else entirely on the side. He had risen through the ranks to the level of inspector in the Federal Preventative Police, the PFP, one of Mexico's main national law enforcement bodies, a position that gave him authority and access, and a salary that was nowhere near sufficient to explain the money he was also receiving. According to the case that Mexican prosecutors eventually built against him, Bayardo had been taking approximately $25,000 per month from the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for sharing information about planned police operations. That was his arrangement. He wore the badge, attended the briefings, had access to the intelligence about upcoming raids and investigations, and then passed the relevant parts of it to people who paid him generously to do so. For an unknown stretch of time before his arrest, that was simply his life. He was arrested in late 2008, and what happened after his arrest is the reason his name appears in the public record at all. Rather than contesting the charges in the conventional way, Bayardo chose cooperation. He agreed to become what Mexican prosecutors called a colaborador, a cooperating witness, someone who would provide testimony and information about the cartel connections he had been paid to maintain, in exchange for whatever protection the Mexican government's witness program could offer him. The decision made him valuable immediately. Bayardo had not been a low-ranking police officer taking small payments to look the other way at the local level. He had been an inspector with genuine access to federal operations, which meant the information he carried about the relationship between the Sinaloa cartel and Mexico's federal law enforcement apparatus was substantial. He became a key witness in the case against Mexico's federal police chief, Victor Garay, and other senior officials who prosecutors alleged had protected and enabled the cartel's operations from inside the country's own security institutions. His information also attracted the attention of the DEA. American agents working in Mexico made contact with him and began receiving intelligence directly from him about cartel operations and the corrupt official networks supporting them. From the DEA's perspective, Bayardo represented exactly the kind of source that made the difference in complex, long-running investigations. Someone who had been on the inside of both the criminal organization and the law enforcement agency supposed to be fighting it, who had watched both worlds operate from a position of genuine access, and who was now willing to describe what he had seen. For a period of months following his arrest and the formalization of his cooperating witness status, Bayardo was providing information to both Mexican prosecutors and American federal agents simultaneously, occupying the peculiar position of a man who had been deeply corrupt and was now deeply useful. What the DEA eventually noticed, and what shifted their assessment of his reliability, was a pattern in what Bayardo was sharing and what he was not. The intelligence he provided showed a clear tilt. He passed information about members and associates of the Beltran Leyva organization, the cartel faction that had split from the Sinaloa cartel in a violent rupture in 2008 and was now operating as a rival to Sinaloa. He named Beltran Leyva connected figures. He provided details about their networks, their operations, their personnel. He gave up information on Edgar Valdez Villarreal, a Texas-born cartel enforcer who went by the nickname La Barbie and who was one of the Beltran Leyva organization's most prominent figures. He was similarly forthcoming about another BLO-connected trafficker known as Harold Poveda, but when it came to Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the longtime co-leader of the Sinaloa cartel, or Zambada's brother Jesus, known as El Rey, or other figures in the Sinaloa structure, Bayardo's information dried up almost completely. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. The DEA agents handling contact with Bayardo began to understand that he had not simply stopped working for the Sinaloa cartel when he was arrested and became a cooperating witness. The $25,000 a month had purchased a relationship that outlasted his arrest. He was providing his American handlers with intelligence designed to damage Sinaloa's rivals, while protecting Sinaloa's own operations from scrutiny, a distinction that was useful to the cartel and useless to any genuine law enforcement effort against it. The confirmation that moved this from suspicion to near certainty came when a DEA source provided agents with surveillance footage showing Bayardo's vehicle parked outside the home of El Rey Zambada, the brother of the cartel's co-founder and the man responsible for managing the organization's bribe payments to corrupt officials. Bayardo was still meeting with Sinaloa people. He was still in contact with the people who had been paying him before his arrest. His witness protection status had not ended that relationship. It had just given him a new audience for selectively useful intelligence, while the old relationship continued alongside. When a DEA agent shared this information with Bayardo directly, confronting him with what had been discovered, Bayardo's response was noted by the agent who observed it. He looked worried. He said very little. The conversation was short. Shortly after this exchange, the information Bayardo's American handlers were willing to share with him and with their Mexican counterparts was significantly restricted. The DEA agents involved began operating carefully around him, aware that whatever they told him had a reasonable chance of reaching the cartel he was supposed to be informing against. The relationship between American investigators and their Mexican counterpart agencies was recalibrated around the assumption that Bayardo's cooperation was compromised, that the man who had been arrested for taking cartel money and had agreed to work with the government was still, in some fundamental sense, working for the cartel. None of this recalibration changed Bayardo's formal status in the Mexican government's witness protection program. He remained a collaborating witness. He continued moving between the government-owned safe houses that Mexico's Attorney General's office maintained for people in his position. The program was structured very differently from the American Witness Security Program, which is administered by the U.S. Marshals Service and involves genuine relocation, new identities, and dedicated protection personnel. Mexico's system, at least as it operated in 2009, provided housed witnesses with certain physical locations where they could stay, but did not give them new identities, did not embed them with protective personnel who accompanied them through their daily movements, and did not prevent them from going where they chose during the day. A high-level source inside the Mexican Attorney General's office described the program at the time as one that kept witnesses in secure houses but allowed them to move about freely, functioning without anything close to the American-style oversight that the word protection implies. Bayardo understood that he was at risk. He was not naive about his situation. He had been a federal police inspector. He understood how these things worked, and he knew that the people he had been informing about had both the motivation to kill him and the institutional connections to find out where he was. The cartel had people inside the government. The government had known this for years, which was in part why the case against Federal Police Chief Garay existed, and which was in part why Bayardo himself had been valuable as a witness in the first place. The same corruption he was testifying about was the corruption that made his protection unreliable. On the morning of Tuesday, December 1st, 2009, Bayardo made his way to a Starbucks located at the corner of Pilares and Pestalozzi in Colonia del Valle, a middle-class neighborhood in the southern part of Mexico City. He was not alone. He was accompanied by a family friend, though that person was not serving in any formal protective capacity. His official escort, a man named Jose Luis Castillo, was also with him or nearby. At noon, Bayardo was sitting inside the coffee shop. Two men got out of a pickup truck outside the Starbucks and walked in. They were dressed in business suits, the kind of attire that in Mexico City's middle-class neighborhoods reads as ordinary and professional rather than alarming. They walked to where Bayardo was sitting and shot him. The attack was over very quickly. Bayardo died from his wounds at the scene. Castillo, his escort, was seriously wounded in the attack. A woman named Maria Eugenia Martinez, 53 years old, a Starbucks patron with no connection to anything happening around her, was shot in the leg. The two men in suits left the way they had come. The killing produced immediate attention and immediate alarm in Mexico City's law enforcement and political circles, and not primarily because of who Bayardo was. The alarm was more specifically about what his death represented for the government's ability to protect its own witnesses. The Bayardo killing was the second high-profile witness death in Mexico within a short span. Less than 2 weeks earlier, a 22-year-old man named Jesus Zambada Reyes, the nephew of El Mayo Zambada, had been found dead inside a federal safe house in Mexico City, where he had been placed under government protection. Officials said he had hanged himself. The assessment of people who understood how these things worked was nearly uniform. Almost nobody in Mexico's law enforcement community accepted the suicide explanation at face value. A man who was the nephew of one of the most powerful cartel bosses in the world, housed in a government safe house after apparently deciding to cooperate with authorities, had turned up dead inside the building he was being protected in, and the government's position was that he had done it to himself. 2 witness deaths inside 2 weeks, one in a protected location and one at a coffee shop, prompted a formal statement from Attorney General Arturo Chavez that he would review Mexico's witness protection program. Samuel Gonzalez, a former senior anti-drug prosecutor with decades of experience in Mexico's justice system, spoke publicly about what the Bayardo killing meant. He said there was no doubt that it was a cartel killing, noting that Bayardo's connections to organized crime had been known or suspected since the 1990s, and he described the murder as a very serious failure for the agency charged with protecting him. He also offered a formulation that cut to the heart of the problem. The story of Edgar Bayardo, he said, was the story of the tragedy of police forces in Mexico. A man who had been paid by a cartel to protect its interests from inside the police, had been arrested, had become a government witness, and had then been shot dead at a coffee table, while technically, under the protection of the same government, he had spent years betraying. Every stage of that sequence of events was produced by the same underlying condition, which was that the line between the state and the cartel in Mexico had, by 2009, been so thoroughly compromised at so many levels that protecting a witness from the cartel required trusting the same institutions the cartel had spent years corrupting. The murder of Bayardo was later referenced extensively during the 2023 federal trial of Genaro Garcia Luna, the former Secretary of Public Security, who was ultimately convicted in an American courtroom of taking millions of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel over the course of his tenure as Mexico's top law enforcement official. The DEA agent who testified about Bayardo's behavior during his cooperation period described the growing suspicion that he was still connected to the cartel. The surveillance footage of his car outside El Rey Zambada's home, and the way the DEA's willingness to share sensitive information with Mexican counterparts had been restricted as a direct consequence of what they were learning about Bayardo's continued relationships. The testimony established Bayardo as part of a broader pattern in which the Sinaloa cartel had successfully placed or maintained people inside Mexico's federal security apparatus at multiple levels simultaneously, so that even the witnesses being generated by prosecutions of that corruption were themselves still connected to the cartel generating the corruption in the first place. Whether the specific order to kill Bayardo came from within the Sinaloa cartel's leadership or from someone acting on the cartel's behalf through the network of corrupt officials he had been involved with, has never been publicly established through a criminal conviction in Mexico. The investigation into his death remained, as of the most recent available public reporting, unresolved in terms of identifying and prosecuting the specific individuals who organized and carried out the attack. What is established is that Bayardo walked into a coffee shop at noon on a Tuesday in Mexico City, in a middle-class neighborhood full of office workers and families going about their day, and 2 men followed him inside and shot him dead in front of other customers. He died there on that Tuesday, in a country where the system that was supposed to be protecting him was the same system his testimony was being used to expose, and those 2 facts were not unrelated. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Bayardo's death showed how easily the cartel could reach someone even inside a government protection program, the next case shows something even more disturbing. What happens when the cartel does not need to find its informant at all, because the government accidentally hands the informant's identity directly to the people trying to kill him, and then the killing spreads far beyond a single person to consume an entire town. Section 6. The unnamed Colombian DEA informant. Somewhere in central Mexico, in a location the public record does not name precisely, a Colombian man was taken from wherever he was and driven to wherever the Beltran Leyva organization had decided he would die. The drive would have taken time enough to understand what was happening. The men who took him knew who he was, knew what he had done, and had been paid $3 million to tell the people who ordered his death exactly where to find him. He had been cooperating with the Drug Enforcement Administration. He had been providing information that was costing the cartel cocaine shipments and money, and the sense of operational security that criminal organizations depend on to function. The cartel had found out his name, obtained his photograph, confirmed his location, and passed all of that to the people who would act on it. He was tortured and killed. His name has never been made public. The sequence of events that ended in that unnamed man's death began in a period of unexpected losses. Between roughly 2007 and 2008, for a stretch of approximately 6 to 7 months, the Beltran Leyva organization found its cocaine shipments being intercepted with a frequency and specificity that did not look like random enforcement activity. The BLO had built its trafficking operation on a partnership with Colombian suppliers who moved product north by sea, traveling in powerboats and submarines to international waters near Mexico, where Beltran Leyva vessels would meet them and transfer the loads to shore. The arrangement had worked smoothly for long enough that the people running it had come to treat its reliability as something close to guaranteed. Then, suddenly, it stopped being reliable. Shipment after shipment was being located and seized by American authorities. The cocaine was not arriving, the money was not flowing, and the cartel's leadership, headed by Arturo Beltran Leyva, was certain of one thing: someone was talking. Arturo Beltran Leyva was the most aggressive and the most violent of the brothers who led the organization. He had built his reputation on the understanding that betrayal had a single consequence, and the discovery that someone inside or connected to his operations had been providing the DEA with the information needed to intercept his shipments produced exactly the response that reputation would suggest. He ordered his lieutenants to find the source of the leak, and he reached out to the people he had been paying inside Mexico's federal government for exactly this kind of assistance. The relationship between the Beltran Leyva organization and Mexico's federal police had been cultivated over years through systematic bribery. The organization, along with its former partners in the Sinaloa cartel, had spent enormous amounts of money building relationships with officials at multiple levels of Mexican law enforcement, and those relationships had purchased protection, intelligence, and access that made the cartel's operations substantially safer than they could otherwise have been. When Arturo Beltran Leyva needed to know who was compromising his cocaine routes, he turned to those relationships. A meeting was convened that included high-ranking members of the cartel and federal officials who had been on its payroll. According to testimony later given by Sergio Villarreal Barragan, a BLO lieutenant who went by the nickname El Grande on account of his 6'8" frame, the meeting brought together cartel figures and a very high official in the federal police. El Grande testified that the official present was Luis Cardenas Palomino, one of the senior members of Mexico's federal police, whose name would later appear among the co-defendants in the federal case against Genaro Garcia Luna, the country's Secretary of Public Security. The mechanism by which the informant's identity was obtained ran through the institutional structures that American investigators had themselves helped create. Mexico's sensitive investigative unit, the specially trained federal police unit that worked directly alongside the DEA and was supposed to represent the most vetted and trustworthy layer of Mexican law enforcement cooperation with American agencies, had a supervisor with a posting that gave him access to the DEA's Colombian operations. According to the account that emerged through court proceedings, a Mexican federal police officer stationed in Colombia had accessed information about the DEA's Colombian informant through whatever institutional channel was available to someone in that position. The information moved from that officer to the officials gathering at the meeting with Arturo Beltran Leyva, and at that meeting, the officials produced a cardboard binder. Inside it was a photograph of the Colombian man, together with his identity. The Colombian man had come to the DEA's attention through the circumstances of his arrest. He had been detained in Miami, the entry point for enormous quantities of South American cocaine during the years when the Medellin and Cali cartels had dominated the trade, and which remained a significant hub for Colombian trafficking networks in the years that followed. After his arrest, he had made the decision that many people in his situation make, agreeing to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for whatever consideration the government could offer in return. His value to the DEA lay in the specificity of what he knew. He understood how the Colombian end of the BLO's supply chain operated, how the cocaine was loaded, how the rendezvous at sea were arranged, what the timing looked like, and what signals were used. He was not providing vague or general intelligence. He was providing operational detail, specific enough to allow American authorities to locate and intercept the actual shipments, which is exactly what had been happening for those 6 to 7 months of sustained losses that had sent Arturo Beltran Leyva looking for answers. The moment Arturo Beltran Leyva was shown the photograph and the name, he had what he needed. El Grande testified that Beltran Leyva ordered a lieutenant named Mario Pineda Villa, known within the organization by the nickname LMP, to find the Colombian man and take him. The order was carried out. 2 high-ranking members of the BLO located the informant, who was somewhere in central Mexico, and abducted him. What happened after the abduction followed the pattern that cartel interrogations of suspected informants followed. The purpose was to extract whatever additional information the man could provide about what he had told the DEA, who else within the organization might have been identified, how much the Americans actually knew, before the interrogation reached its conclusion. He was tortured. He was killed. The $3 million that changed hands as payment for his identity was divided among Ivan Reyes Arzate, who commanded the sensitive investigative unit, and the other federal police officials whose cooperation had made the identification possible. That figure, $3 million for a single piece of intelligence, reflects how much the BLO valued the information and how catastrophic the sustained interceptions had been for the organization's finances. If 6 to 7 months of seized cocaine shipments represented tens of millions of dollars in lost product, $3 million to find and eliminate the source of the leak was not an extravagant price. It was a calculated investment in operational security, paid through the same corrupt channels that had been sustaining the relationship between the cartel and Mexico's federal police for years. The Colombian man's name has not been released in any public legal proceeding connected to his death. He appears in the court record as a category, a DEA confidential informant, rather than as a person with a history and a family and a story of his own. What can be inferred from the circumstances of his cooperation is that he had accepted a serious risk in agreeing to provide the DEA with information about a cartel capable of the kind of violence it ultimately directed at him. The decision to cooperate after an arrest is rarely made from a position of comfort or freedom. It is made by people who are facing prison and who calculate that the alternative being offered is better than the years in custody they would otherwise serve. Whatever that calculation looked like for the Colombian man in Miami, whatever he was told about how his cooperation would be handled, about what protections were available to someone in his position, the outcome suggests that the gap between what he was promised and what he received was total. The story of how his identity was compromised points to a structural problem that goes beyond the specific corruption of specific individuals. The sensitive investigative unit had been created precisely to address the problem of cartel penetration of Mexico's regular law enforcement. The DEA had personally trained every officer assigned to it and had vetted them to a standard that was supposed to make the unit resistant to the kind of corruption that had made working with Mexico's ordinary police forces so unreliable. The unit existed because American investigators had concluded that operating without a trusted Mexican law enforcement partner was impossible, and that creating one required building it from scratch, with American involvement in the selection and training process. That entire effort, that years-long project of building a trustworthy Mexican federal law enforcement unit, was being simultaneously undermined by the fact that the unit's own supervisor was on the cartel's payroll. The vetting had failed to catch Reyes Arzate. The institutional trust that the DEA had invested in the SIU had been exploited through exactly the mechanism it was designed to prevent. The public accountability for what happened to the Colombian informant came indirectly, through the prosecutions of the officials responsible, rather than through any proceeding specifically focused on his death. Ivan Reyes Arzate pleaded guilty in Chicago in 2018 and eventually received a total of 10 years in federal prison across 2 separate cases. His sentencing hearing in the first case was where El Grande took the stand and provided his account of the meeting, the cardboard binder, the photograph, and the order that followed. The testimony established the causal chain from a corrupt official's access to a DEA informant's identity to that informant's kidnapping and murder, with enough specificity that the court could understand exactly what Reyes Arzate's betrayal had cost and who had paid the price for it. Garcia Luna's trial in Brooklyn in 2023 returned to this ground. The Colombian informant's death was not the centerpiece of that proceeding, which dealt with the full scope of Garcia Luna's decade-long corruption on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel, but it was part of the evidentiary landscape that prosecutors used to establish the consequences of the system Garcia Luna had presided over and enabled. A senior DEA agent who testified during the trial described the period during which the DEA had become increasingly aware that Bayardo was protecting Sinaloa while giving up Beltran Leyva targets, and the parallel awareness that sensitive information shared with Mexican federal counterparts was moving in directions it was not supposed to move. The Colombian informant's death was one of the events that had made American investigators recalibrate how much they were willing to share and with whom. What the Colombian man's case illustrates, stripped to its essentials, is the specific vulnerability of informants who are cooperating against organizations with the resources and connections to find them through channels the informants cannot see or protect themselves against. A cartel that can walk into a meeting with government officials and walk out with a photograph and an identity has effectively neutralized the protection that the anonymity of an informant is supposed to provide. The DEA's confidential informant program depends on the assumption that the agencies receiving intelligence generated by an informant's cooperation cannot or will not trace that intelligence back to its source. That assumption breaks down completely when the officials sharing the intelligence are simultaneously on the cartel's payroll and being asked directly to identify whoever is providing it. The Colombian man had no way of knowing that the federal police unit, sitting across the table from his DEA handlers, was run by someone who would sell his name to the people hunting him. He had no way of knowing that the institutional structures meant to insulate him from discovery had been purchased by the organization he was informing against. His death preceded the public exposure of the corruption that caused it by nearly a decade. Reyes Arzate was not arrested until 2017. Garcia Luna was not arrested until 2019. The Colombian man was killed on the basis of information sold by officials who were supposed to be fighting the cartel he had agreed to help fight, years before anyone outside a small circle of investigators and cartel members knew that the sale had taken place. He died in whatever location the BLO's men took him to, unnamed, unacknowledged in any public statement from the DEA or the Justice Department at the time, a person whose cooperation had been genuine and whose protection had been comprehensively betrayed by the same institutions asking for it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the Colombian informant's death came from a single targeted betrayal, the next case shows what happens when a cartel decides that identifying and killing one informant is not enough, and instead takes revenge on everyone even remotely connected to the people who talked, destroying an entire town in the process. Section 7. The Allende Massacre. In the Dallas suburbs, in the years just before everything fell apart, in a small Mexican border town, the DEA's field office was running an investigation they had named Operation 2 Legit to Quit. The name had the slightly self-conscious quality of agency operations that get titled by people who spend too much time in conference rooms, but the work underneath it was serious, and the target was significant. Agents had been tracking a cocaine distribution network connected to the Zetas cartel, peeling back layers of the operation through arrests and intercepted shipments, and they had arrived at a figure they considered genuinely important: a 30-year-old Dallas native named Jose Vasquez Jr., who went by the nickname El Diablo, and who was moving truckloads of cocaine, cash, and weapons between Mexico and East Texas every month on behalf of the Zetas leadership. The DEA's introduction to Vasquez had come through a traffic stop that revealed $802,000 in cash, vacuum-packed and hidden inside the gas tank of a pickup truck. The driver of that truck said he worked for a man he knew only as El Diablo. More arrests followed, more pieces of the network came into view, and DEA agent Richard Martinez and Assistant U.S. Attorney Ernest Gonzalez eventually traced El Diablo back to Vasquez, who by that point had slipped across the border into Mexico to avoid the arrest he could see coming. He had family connections in Allende, a small ranching community in the northern Mexican state of Coahuila, roughly 25 miles from the Texas border. He sought protection there from members of the Zetas organization, while the DEA worked out what to do next. What the DEA did next is the decision that this story turns on. Vasquez was gone, across the border, and directly arresting him was not an option. But he was still in contact with people on the Mexican side of the Zetas organization, which meant he still had access to information the DEA wanted. Under pressure from American investigators who were holding criminal exposure over his head, and whose leverage extended to family members who were still reachable on the American side, Vasquez agreed to help the DEA in a specific way. He would obtain the personal identification numbers for the cell phones belonging to two of the most powerful figures in the entire Zetas organization, the brothers Miguel Trevino Morales, known as Z40, and Omar Trevino Morales, known as Z42. Those pins, once in the DEA's possession, would allow American investigators to monitor the Treviños' communications and track their movements. To get the pins, Vasquez needed help from someone inside the cartel's structure who had access to the phones or to the people who managed them. He turned to a Zetas lieutenant named Héctor Moreno Villanueva. The leverage Vasquez used to secure Moreno's cooperation was the same kind that had been used on Vasquez himself. Moreno's brother, Gilberto, had been caught driving the truck with the $800,000 in the gas tank and was facing 20 years in federal prison in the United States. Vasquez arranged for a lawyer in Dallas to represent Gilberto and promised not to let anyone in the cartel know about the incriminating statements Gilberto had already made to investigators. In exchange, Moreno provided the Treviños' phone pins to Vasquez, who passed them to the DEA. The DEA then faced a decision about what to do with the information. American agents operating in Mexico needed Mexican law enforcement partners to act on intelligence, and the institutional channel for that kind of joint operation was the Sensitive Investigative Unit, the specialized federal police unit that the DEA had trained and worked alongside for years. Despite the SIU's documented history of leaking sensitive information to criminal organizations, A supervisor in the DEA's structure in Mexico City shared the PIN information with the unit. Within the SIU, the information traveled in exactly the direction that the cartel's extensive investment in corrupting that unit had been designed to make it travel. The Trevino brothers found out that their phones had been compromised. They found out because the people who had been paid to find out had done their jobs. The Zetas leadership understood immediately that only a small number of people could have had access to the Trevino's personal phone pins. The circle was narrow enough that tracing the leak required almost no investigative effort. Two names landed at the center of the cartel's accounting of responsibility: Jose Vasquez Jr. and a man from one of Allende's oldest and most established families, Jose Luis Garza Gaitan. Whether Garza Gaitan was actually involved in the leak, or whether his name ended up in the cartel's assessment of guilt through a misidentification connected to his family's overlapping relationships with Vasquez and with Moreno, is something the public record does not resolve with certainty. What is certain is that the Zetas determined, rightly or wrongly, that the Garza family was connected to the betrayal of the Trevino's communications, and what followed from that determination was not a targeted killing of the two men the cartel believed responsible. Both Vasquez and Garza had already fled to the United States by the time the cartel's response came. What followed instead was something that defies easy categorization within the vocabulary of organized crime violence. On the evening of Friday, March 18, 2011, convoys of heavily armed Zetas gunmen began arriving in Allende. The timing, a Friday evening as the week's work was winding down and families were settling into their weekends, appears to have been deliberate, chosen for the maximum number of people likely to be at home on the Garza and Moreno family ranches and properties that were the operation's initial targets. The first wave of violence struck those ranches. People were seized from their homes, pulled from dinner tables, taken from wherever they happened to be when the armed men arrived. The properties were ransacked, looted, and then destroyed. Houses were demolished, not simply by fire, but in some cases by heavy machinery that the cartel had brought specifically for the purpose of erasing the structures entirely, reducing family homes that had stood for generations to rubble and scorched earth. The bodies of people killed during those initial hours were taken to a ranch just outside Allende, where the cartel had established what investigators, who later examined the site, would describe as an incineration facility. People were killed, and their remains were burned in an effort to eliminate physical evidence of what had happened to them and how many of them there had been. The incineration was not complete in every case, and the remnants found at the site years later, when Mexican military and police forces finally moved in to conduct a forensic investigation, reflected the scale of what had taken place there without resolving the precise number of deaths. The operation did not stay within the boundaries of the Garza and Moreno family properties. Over the 3 days that followed the initial assault, Zetas units moved through Allende and into the neighboring communities of Nava and Piedras Negras, the last of which sits directly on the Rio Grande, across from Eagle Pass, Texas. The logic that governed who was taken expanded as the hours passed. Initially, the targeting followed family names: Garza, Gaitan, Moreno, Villanueva. People who shared those surnames, regardless of whether they had any connection to the drug trade or any knowledge of the events that had preceded the cartel's arrival, were at risk. Then the net expanded further to include neighbors, people who had been witnessed interacting with the target families, people who had been in the wrong place when the Zetas men arrived and who could not establish their innocence to the satisfaction of gunmen who were not in the business of establishing innocence before acting. The emergency response system in Allende and Piedras Negras received 1,451 calls during the initial days of the violence. Almost none of those calls produced a response. Municipal police in Allende did not respond to calls for help during the assault. A March 2018 report from Mexico's National Human Rights Commission confirmed that members of the municipal police had not only failed to respond, but had in some cases actively participated in the disappearances of residents. The fire chief at the time, Evaristo Trevino, later described the situation directly. The only option available to emergency personnel was to stand down. They were afraid for their lives. They could not fight bullets with water, so they did not go. Families who tried to reach army and military bases to report what was happening were told that soldiers had gone to investigate specific locations and found no one, which was true in the literal sense that the people who had been there had already been taken. The Mexican state government's official response in the weeks and months following the massacre was to minimize the public accounting of what had happened. Officials acknowledged that violence had occurred and that people were missing, but the numbers they put forward were a fraction of what the families of victims and independent investigators would eventually document. State authorities initially said approximately 28 people had died or disappeared in connection with the events of March 18th through 20th. Families of victims said the number was closer to 300. A 2017 investigation by reporter Ginger Thompson for ProPublica and National Geographic, which drew on months of interviews with survivors, former cartel members, law enforcement officials on both sides of the border, and family members of the dead and missing, documented evidence connecting at least 60 specific deaths and disappearances to the attack. A subsequent report from researchers at the Colegio de Mexico, one of the country's most prestigious academic institutions, concluded that the number of dead and missing was likely greater than 100 and possibly approached 300. Hugo Cesar Roman Chavarria, a high-ranking Zetas member who went by the nickname El Vecino, was indicted in the United States in September 2011 on drug trafficking charges and eventually extradited from Mexico to face those charges in the Eastern District of Texas. His sentencing hearing, held over 3 days in August and September 2021, included testimony from other former Zetas members who had themselves been extradited and were cooperating with American prosecutors. Those witnesses described Roman Chavarria's participation in the cartel's operations in the region during the period of the massacre, and the court record from that proceeding references the Allende massacre explicitly, noting that witnesses described events connected to the defendant's activities that occurred during that period. Roman Chavarria pleaded guilty and received a life sentence. The Justice Department, in describing the case, acknowledged that a definitive conclusion had never been reached about the total number of people killed, but stated that the total was believed to be at least 100 and possibly as high as 300. The DEA's accountability for its role in the sequence of events that produced the massacre has never been resolved through any formal proceeding or public acknowledgement commensurate with the scale of what happened. Agent Richard Martinez, who led the Dallas investigation and who shared the PIN information with the SIU supervisor in Mexico City, was named DEA Agent of the Year in 2011, the same year as the massacre. He later agreed to speak with the ProPublica and National Geographic journalists who investigated the story, and his account of how he felt about the information being compromised was conveyed in terms that reflected genuine distress. He did not want to say. He would rather leave it at that. By the time those interviews took place, Martinez had been diagnosed with kidney cancer and was undergoing treatment that had so far not succeeded in controlling the disease. The DEA, as an institution, did not investigate what had happened to the information after it was shared with the SIU. The agency did not contact Mexican authorities about the massacre or discuss it with them as something connected to the DEA's own operational decisions. The families of the people killed and disappeared in Allende were never contacted by the DEA. They were never told that there was a sequence of American law enforcement decisions that had contributed to the chain of events that destroyed their families. The ProPublica and National Geographic investigation in 2017 was the first time the DEA had ever commented publicly on the massacre or its potential connection to Operation Too Legit to Quit. In those interviews, agency representatives apologized for the intelligence leak and placed the blame for the violence on the Zetas. They were not wrong that the Zetas had carried out the killing. They were not accounting for the full picture of how the Zetas had come to know where to go and whose names to look for when they arrived. Vasquez and Garza, the two men whose cooperation with the DEA had set everything in motion, crossed into the United States before the Zetas arrived in Allende. They were alive. The people who died in the town, where one of them had family connections and from whose families the cartel had drawn its list of targets, were not. They had no informant relationships with American law enforcement, no involvement in the DEA's operation, no prior knowledge of what Vasquez had provided or what it had cost. They shared surnames and addresses with the people the cartel was looking for. That was sufficient. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the Allende massacre unfolded through a chain of decisions and accidents that most of its victims never had any chance to see coming, the next case on this list involves people who were targeted not because of anything they did in private, but because of what they chose to say in public, posting information about the Zetas online under anonymous screen names in a city where the cartel had decided that anonymity was no longer a protection it was willing to tolerate. Section 8. Marisol Macias Castañeda and the Nuevo Laredo Internet Snitches. Nuevo Laredo sits on the southern bank of the Rio Grande, directly across from Laredo, Texas, connected to the American side by a bridge that carries more commercial truck traffic than almost any other land port of entry in the United States. It is a city built around movement, around the flow of goods and people, and, inevitably, around the flow of everything else that finds its way through the same corridors that legitimate commerce uses. By 2011, the Zetas cartel controlled Nuevo Laredo and the surrounding state of Tamaulipas with a thoroughness that had reduced the city's mainstream press to near silence. Journalists who covered cartel activity in Nuevo Laredo did so at the risk of their lives, and the risk was not theoretical. Several reporters working in the city had been killed or had disappeared in the years preceding 2011. The newspaper El Mañana, one of the main outlets covering the region, had been attacked twice, once in 2004 and once in 2006, in incidents that made clear to everyone working there exactly what the cartel thought of coverage that did not suit it. The result was a press corps that had largely stopped covering what the cartel was doing in any way that could be described as journalism. They reported accidents and weather, and local government and sports. They did not report on the men with weapons who controlled the streets. Into that silence, the internet had offered something. A website called Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, which translates roughly as Nuevo Laredo Live, had emerged as a platform where residents of the city could post information about what was happening around them in real time under anonymous screen names or simply anonymously with no name at all. The site published information that no mainstream outlet in the city would touch: locations where drugs were being sold, addresses of safe houses where the cartel stored product, the positions of the halcones, the cartel's lookout network, young men positioned at key intersections to watch for police movements and report back on anything unusual. The site also published warnings. If there was going to be a roadblock, if armed men had been spotted moving through a particular neighborhood, if a confrontation was developing somewhere in the city, that information went up on Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, and people read it before deciding whether to take their children to school or whether to use a different route to work. The site was not staffed by professional journalists. It was run by people who lived in the city and wanted information to move between residents who needed it. Its administrators and contributors used pseudonyms consistently, understanding at some level that what they were doing was dangerous without, perhaps, fully reckoning with how dangerous the Zetas were willing to make it. The cartel had been watching the site and others like it, in the language the Zetas used internally and that leaked into their public warnings. The people posting on these sites were ratas, rats. They were soplones. They were internet snitches. The word snitch in this context carried the full weight of cartel enforcement logic. It was not necessary to be providing information to the police directly to qualify. Posting cartel movements and safe house locations in a place where members of the public could read them was sufficient. The cartel's intelligence depended on controlling what was known and by whom. The anonymous online platforms were eroding that control, and by the summer of 2011, the Zetas had decided to respond. The morning of September 13th, 2011, brought the first public demonstration of how the Zetas intended to handle online informants. 2 young people were found hanging from a pedestrian bridge in Nuevo Laredo, in a location visible from the street below. They were not old. Both were in their 20s, 1 male and 1 female. Their bodies had been subjected to extreme violence before they were hung from the bridge. They had been disemboweled. Their hands were bound behind their backs. Suspended from the bridge above a busy road in full daylight, they were impossible to miss and impossible to misunderstand. Alongside the bodies, the Zetas had attached banners. The message on those banners was addressed directly to the people running and using the online platforms the cartel had been monitoring. It named 3 specific websites: Frontera, Al Rojo Vivo, Blog del Narco, and Denuncia Ciudadano, along with the general category of social media reporting on cartel activities. The text warned that this was what would happen to all internet snitches. It told the people reading it that the cartel was watching. The banner was signed with a Z. The 2 victims were not identified publicly at the time. Their names have not appeared in any confirmed public record as of the most recent available reporting, which means they belong to the category of people whose deaths the cartel made into a spectacle while simultaneously ensuring that everything specific about them, who they were, where they lived, who loved them, would not be attached to the display. The Zetas were not interested in them as individuals. They were interested in them as a message, and the message was constructed accordingly. Maximum visibility, maximum horror, minimum information that might allow the audience to see the victims as people rather than as an object lesson. The Nuevo Laredo en Vivo website, which had been the site where some of this online reporting activity had been concentrated, posted a tribute to the victims and continued operating. Users wrote messages of defiance in the site's forums. They noted that the cartel's furious response to what the site was doing was itself evidence that the reporting was working, that if the lookouts and safe houses and movements being posted online had not been causing the cartel real problems, the cartel would not have gone to these lengths to respond. The site's administrators kept putting information up. Ordinary residents of Nuevo Laredo kept reading it and kept contributing to it. The bridge display had been designed to stop that. It had not stopped it. 12 days later, on September 24th, 2011, the Zetas tried again, and this time they had a name. Marisol Macias Castañeda was born around 1972 and had built a career in journalism in Nuevo Laredo that had brought her to the position of editor-in-chief at a local newspaper called Primera Hora. That was her public professional identity. A newspaper editor, a woman with an administrative title at a local outlet, someone working in the legitimate press, in a city where working in the legitimate press meant knowing exactly which lines could not be crossed if you wanted to continue doing the job. She was careful in her professional capacity in the way that journalists working in cartel-controlled cities learn to be careful, understanding that the paper's survival and her own depended on not publishing what the cartel did not want published through official channels. But she had a second identity, one that lived online and that she maintained with the particular care of someone who understood that what she was doing under that identity was genuinely dangerous. On Twitter and on Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, she posted under the screen name La Nena de Laredo, which translates as the girl from Laredo. Under that name, she reported in real time on the cartel activity she observed and that residents of the city passed on to her. She posted warnings about cartel movements. She celebrated the arrests of cartel members and encouraged others to keep reporting. She wrote messages of solidarity, with the people using the site as a tool for collective awareness in a city where the official channels of information had been comprehensively captured by the people doing the most harm. Her posts encouraged army deployments and praised marine operations. She called on citizens not to give up, to keep reporting, to trust that the information being shared was making a difference. She was one of the site's most prominent and most active contributors, described by people familiar with the platform's internal workings as its most important collaborator. How the Zetas identified her is not something the public record resolves. The investigation into her death did not produce a publicly documented account of how her anonymous screen name was connected to her real identity. The Committee to Protect Journalists, which tracked her case, noted that her killing highlighted the urgent need for journalists working in dangerous environments to receive training in digital security. The implication being that some failure of operational security on her part, some detail that connected her pseudonym to her real name or her real location, had made identification possible. Whether that connection was technical, whether it came through human intelligence within the city, whether someone who knew her recognized something specific in her writing or her posting patterns, remains unknown. On September 24, 2011, her decapitated body was found near a monument on a busy road in Nuevo Laredo. Her head was placed separately. Alongside her remains, the Zetas had left a note. The note was addressed to Nuevo Laredo en Vivo and to social media sites in general, and it was written in the first person, as if it were Marisol Macias herself speaking. It said that this was what had happened to the author because of her reports, and because of the reports of whoever was reading. It stated that this was what happened to people for trusting in the Army and Marines. The note was signed with her screen name, La Nena de Laredo, followed by a string of Z's, the Zeta's signature. The cartel had not simply killed her. It had taken her name, her online identity, the persona she had built to report on them, and used it to write the message, explaining why she had been killed, forcing her voice into service of the warning directed at everyone who had read what she wrote. She was 39 years old. UNESCO's Director General responded to her killing with a public statement. The Committee to Protect Journalists documented her case and called it the first confirmed murder of a journalist in Mexico killed in retaliation for reporting conducted on a social media site. The Tamaulipas Attorney General's office announced an investigation. The investigation did not produce public results. Marisol Macias was the fourth woman journalist killed in Mexico that year, in a country that was already among the most dangerous in the world for the press. The Nuevo Laredo en Vivo website put up a memorial banner with her screen name and the message that she would always be present. Users continued posting. More people contributed information to the site after her death than before it, at least in the immediate aftermath, which suggests that the Zetas' strategy of killing online informants to silence online reporting was not producing the results they intended, or at least not quickly enough for the pace of killing they were willing to sustain. They sustained it. On November 9, 2011, 46 days after Marisol Macias was killed, a man was found beheaded at an intersection in Nuevo Laredo. He had been one of the moderators of Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, contributing to the site under the screen name Rascatripas, which translates as belly scratcher. The note left with his body stated that this had happened to him because he had not understood that he should not be reporting on social networks. He was beheaded at the same intersection where Marisol Macias had been killed 6 weeks earlier, a detail that was either coincidental or deliberate, and given the Zetas' evident interest in communicating specific messages through the geography of their violence, the latter seems more likely. Rascatripas had no confirmed public name attached to his case in the reporting that followed. He existed in the coverage as his screen name and as the description of what had happened to him. The wave of killings connected to Nuevo Laredo en Vivo and similar sites did not stop with Rascatripas. In the period following his death, Additional individuals who had not been identified as journalists were killed by the Zetas in retaliation for postings to the same or similar platforms. The exact number depends on what threshold of confirmed connection to online activity is applied, and Mexican authorities were not forthcoming with comprehensive accounting. The Zetas, for their part, were deploying their own technical resources against the online reporting campaign. According to a report from the security analysis firm Stratfor that circulated in late 2011, the cartel had begun deploying teams of individuals with computer expertise, tasked specifically with tracking and identifying people involved in the anti-cartel online campaigns, an indication that the anonymous platforms had disrupted cartel operations seriously enough to justify a dedicated counterintelligence effort. What the Zetas could not fully account for in their response was the nature of what they were fighting. The platforms they were trying to silence through killing were not newspapers with offices and printing presses and mastheads. They were distributed networks of anonymous contributors who could post from any internet connection, who had no fixed location that could be destroyed, no editorial staff that could be threatened into compliance, no publisher who could be pressured into pulling a story. Killing specific individuals who used the platforms removed those individuals. It sent a message that the cartel was watching and that it would find people who talked, but it could not prevent other people from making the same choice that Marisol Macias had made, from deciding that the risk was worth it, from continuing to post cartel lookout positions and safe house locations and movement patterns in a city that had no other functioning mechanism for getting that information to people who needed it. What happened to the people who made that choice in Nuevo Laredo in 2011 stands as one of the clearest illustrations of something that runs through every case on this list: the cartel's willingness to cross whatever threshold of violence is necessary to stop the flow of information it cannot control. Marisol Macias was not a professional intelligence asset. She was not a trained government informant with a handler and an extraction plan. She was a newspaper editor who had chosen a screen name and an anonymous account through which she reported what she saw, because the city she lived in had no other functional journalism, and because she believed, as her posts made clear repeatedly, that reporting was one of the paths through the darkness that the Zetas had imposed on Nuevo Laredo. She paid for that belief with everything she had. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While Marisol Macias and the other Nuevo Laredo victims were killed because the Zetas tracked them down through surveillance and human intelligence, the next case shows a different method entirely. A cartel that hired a professional hacker to penetrate the communications of a senior American federal official, turning the surveillance infrastructure of Mexico City's own streets against the people the FBI was trying to protect. Section 9. The Sinaloa Cartel Hacker Operation. In June 2025, the Justice Department's Office of the Inspector General released a report that had been prepared as a broad assessment of the risks facing the FBI from what the document called ubiquitous technical surveillance, a phrase that refers to the proliferation of commercial and criminal surveillance technology and the ways in which that technology has made it increasingly possible for sophisticated adversaries to identify, track, and compromise federal law enforcement operations. The report covered a range of concerns and vulnerabilities, and most of it dealt with systemic issues rather than specific events. But buried within its heavily redacted pages was an account of something specific that had happened in Mexico City in 2018 or earlier, something that illustrated precisely why the FBI's Inspector General had decided that this category of threat deserved a formal assessment at the highest levels of the agency's oversight structure. The Sinaloa cartel had hired a hacker. Criminal organizations have used hackers for years, and the Sinaloa cartel in particular had by 2018 demonstrated a consistent and sophisticated approach to using technology in service of its operations, from encrypted communications platforms to counter-surveillance equipment to the kind of technical expertise that its leaders, increasingly drawn from a generation that had grown up with digital tools, brought to the business of drug trafficking. What made this particular operation remarkable was not that the cartel had hired someone with computer skills. It was what that person was able to do, and who they were able to do it to. The target was an FBI assistant legal attaché stationed at the United States Embassy in Mexico City. The assistant legal attaché is a specific role within the FBI's international operations structure, one that involves working closely with Mexican law enforcement agencies on cases with cross-border dimensions. In practical terms, someone in that position is a senior FBI official whose daily work involves building and maintaining relationships with Mexican investigators and officials, coordinating intelligence sharing between the two countries, and serving as a point of contact between the FBI's Washington-based case teams and the Mexican law enforcement environment in which those cases are unfolding. The person holding that role in Mexico City during the relevant period was, by definition, someone who had regular contact with a wide range of individuals on both sides of the official and unofficial spectrum of people useful to American investigators, including confidential informants and potential cooperating witnesses. The FBI at that time was actively working the case against Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the former Sinaloa cartel co-leader who had been extradited to the United States in January 2017 and whose trial in the Eastern District of New York was building toward the proceedings that would eventually begin in November 2018. The Sinaloa cartel's leadership, which had survived Guzman's extradition and was functioning under new arrangements following his removal from the scene, had obvious and urgent reasons to be interested in understanding what the FBI knew about the case being built against its former boss, who were cooperating with American investigators, and what relationships the FBI was cultivating in Mexico that might produce additional evidence or additional witnesses. The stakes of the Guzman prosecution were high enough that the cartel's investment in understanding and undermining it was significant. The hacker the cartel hired offered what the Inspector General's report described as a menu of services. The language suggests someone operating in a professional capacity, providing criminal organizations with technical capabilities on a fee-for-service basis rather than a freelancer with a single skill. The services on that menu included the ability to manipulate mobile phones and other electronic devices, to extract data from communications networks, and to access information systems that were not supposed to be publicly accessible. The cartel selected from that menu the specific capabilities it needed to surveil an FBI official operating inside the American Embassy compound in one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. The first capability the hacker deployed was against the FBI attaché's phone. Through means the Inspector General's report does not detail publicly, the hacker obtained the official's phone number. That number then became the entry point for a more extensive intrusion. Using the phone number, the hacker was able to extract records of calls made and received by the FBI official, information that would have revealed the full pattern of the official's communications: who was calling in, who was being called, at what times, with what frequency. For an investigator whose work involved regular contact with informants and potential witnesses, a record of every call made and received over any meaningful period of time was essentially a roadmap to every relationship the investigation was trying to protect. The hacker did not stop there. The second capability deployed was access to Mexico City's surveillance camera system. This is not a capability that sounds immediately alarming to anyone who has not thought carefully about how modern urban surveillance infrastructure works. Mexico City, like most large cities, has an extensive network of security cameras covering streets, intersections, transit hubs, and public spaces. That network is managed by city authorities and is nominally accessible only to law enforcement and government officials with appropriate authorization. What the Inspector General's report established is that the hacker was able to gain unauthorized access to that system and use it specifically to track the FBI attaché through the city. The practical consequence of this was that the cartel could follow the FBI official from the embassy through the streets of Mexico City, observing every meeting, every destination, every person who sat down across a table or walked alongside the attaché through any public space in the city. If a potential witness had come to the embassy for a meeting, the cameras could show who left the building and when. If the FBI official had traveled to a specific neighborhood to meet a contact, the camera network could document the route and identify anyone who appeared repeatedly in the official's trajectory through the city. The hacker was essentially providing the Sinaloa cartel with real-time and recorded surveillance of an FBI officer's entire operational life in Mexico City, and through that surveillance, the cartel was building a comprehensive picture of who was talking to American investigators and where those people could be found. The Inspector General's report is explicit about what the cartel did with this information. According to the case agent whose account informed the relevant section of the report, the cartel used what the hacker had provided to intimidate and, in some instances, kill potential sources or cooperating witnesses. That sentence is doing significant work. It is confirming that people died as a consequence of this surveillance operation, that the information the hacker extracted from the FBI official's phone and from Mexico City's camera network was translated into specific targeting decisions, and that those targeting decisions resulted in the deaths of individuals who had been in contact with the FBI or who the cartel had identified as potential threats to its operations through the surveillance data it had obtained. The report does not name those individuals. It does not say how many people were killed. It does not describe the specific circumstances of any particular death. It does not say whether the people who died were formal confidential informants, whether they were individuals who had simply agreed to speak with FBI personnel without any official cooperating agreement in place, or whether some of them were people who had been identified by the cartel through the camera footage as meeting with the FBI official without themselves having any knowledge that they were in danger. The redactions in the report are extensive, which means that even what the Inspector General knew and chose to document is not fully visible to the public. What the report does make clear, in the parts that were released without redaction, is that some within both the FBI and the CIA had described the category of threat represented by this operation as existential. That word, used in the context of an Inspector General's assessment of a law enforcement agency's vulnerability, is not a word chosen casually. It reflects a judgment that the ability of sophisticated criminal organizations to use commercial and criminal surveillance technology against federal law enforcement operations represents not merely a tactical inconvenience, but a fundamental challenge to the viability of the kind of undercover and informant-based intelligence work that the FBI and partner agencies have depended on for decades. If the cartel can hire someone to read an FBI official's call logs and watch that official move through a city, the entire operational model of cultivating human sources in dangerous environments becomes something different than what it has historically been assumed to be. The FBI case agent who described the incident in terms that made it into the Inspector General's report noted that the Bureau had been working on the El Chapo case at the time. The timing matters because the El Chapo prosecution was, at that point, one of the most significant drug trafficking cases in American legal history. The government was building a case that would eventually feature testimony from more than 50 witnesses, including 14 of Guzman's own former close associates, men who had participated in cartel operations at the highest levels and were now cooperating with American prosecutors. The Sinaloa cartel's interest in knowing who was talking to the FBI in Mexico City during the period leading up to that trial was not abstract. The cartel was trying to identify cooperating witnesses before their testimony could be locked into a formal legal record. Finding them early enough gave the cartel options for dealing with them that finding them after the trial began would not. The broader context of the Inspector General's report situates the hacker incident within a pattern that extends beyond the Sinaloa cartel's specific operation. The same report notes that in 2011, in a separate event, Information about DEA informants working against the Zetas was leaked through compromised Mexican federal police channels and resulted in a massacre in the town of Allende, in Coahuila, where dozens to hundreds of people were killed. That incident and the Sinaloa hacker operation represent different mechanisms for achieving the same outcome: the identification of people cooperating with American law enforcement, followed by violence against those people. The 2011 incident worked through human corruption inside a joint law enforcement unit. The 2018 operation worked through technology applied against an American official's communications. The result in both cases was the same. People who had agreed to provide information to American investigators died because the cartel found out who they were. The Inspector General used the phrase "advances in data mining and analysis, facial recognition, and computer network exploitation" to describe why the threat had become more acute in recent years. The underlying argument is that the same commercial technology that has made it easier for ordinary people to navigate cities, to communicate instantly across distances, and to find information about almost anything, has also made it easier for criminal organizations with money and technical resources to identify law enforcement personnel and their contacts. Surveillance cameras that cities install to manage traffic and deter street crime become a tool for tracking FBI officials if someone with the right access decides to use them that way. Phone networks that connect billions of people become a vulnerability if the records those networks generate can be extracted by someone who has obtained a specific phone number through criminal means. The technology itself is neutral. What determines its consequences is who has access to it and what they choose to do with it. The report urged the FBI to conduct an enterprise-wide threat assessment to determine where the agency was most vulnerable to this kind of technical surveillance. The FBI's public response to the report's release indicated that the Bureau was working on a strategic plan to address the Inspector General's concerns. Neither document provides any information about whether the people killed as a result of the 2018 operation in Mexico City have been identified, whether their families have been notified of any connection between those deaths and the intelligence failure documented in the report, or whether any legal accountability for the specific killings has been pursued or is being pursued. The hacker who carried out the operation was not named in the report and has not been publicly identified in any subsequent reporting. The FBI official who was surveilled was not named. The individuals who were killed were not named. The entire incident, which resulted in the deaths of American law enforcement sources in a foreign country, exists in the public record as a heavily redacted passage in an Inspector General's report released more than 6 years after the events it describes. What the incident represents, stripped of the technical vocabulary the Inspector General's report uses to discuss it, is something straightforward and terrible. People who had agreed to talk to the FBI, whether formally or informally, were identified through the surveillance of an FBI official's daily movements through a city. The cartel gathered that information through a hired hacker and a phone number and a camera network. It then used that information to find those people and kill them. The FBI's ability to protect those people from discovery was defeated not by a leak from within the Bureau's own ranks, not by a corrupt official selling a name from a file, but by technology applied systematically against the physical reality of how an FBI official moves through a foreign city. The informants died because someone with a laptop and a contract could see everything the person they were meeting with did, everywhere that person went, and everyone that person sat across from in a coffee shop or a park or a car somewhere in Mexico City, while the Sinaloa cartel watched through cameras it was not supposed to have access to and read phone records it was not supposed to be able to obtain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. While the cartel's use of hacking and camera surveillance showed how technology had transformed the hunting of informants, the final case on this list goes back to something more direct and more brutal. A Sinaloa cartel security commander who in October 2023 kidnapped a DEA source and 10 other people, killed 8 of them, and left behind a body count that included a 13-year-old boy. Section 10. The DEA confidential source, killed by El Nini, Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, was 32 years old when Mexican authorities arrested him in Culiacan, Sinaloa, on November 22, 2023, and he had spent most of the preceding decade building a reputation as one of the most feared men operating inside the Sinaloa cartel's internal security apparatus. He led a group within the cartel known internally as the Ninis, a force whose specific purpose was providing personal security for Los Chapitos, the 4 sons of imprisoned former cartel co-leader Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who had inherited large portions of their father's trafficking operation and rebuilt it around the production and distribution of fentanyl. The Ninis were not a conventional security detail in any sense that word suggests professionalism or restraint. They were an enforcement unit whose methods included kidnapping, torture, and execution, and whose mandate extended beyond protecting the Chapitos to eliminating anyone the cartel leadership identified as a threat to its operations or its secrets. To understand what happened in October 2023 and why it happened when it did, requires understanding the specific environment the Chapitos were operating in during that period. The spring of 2023 had been an extraordinarily difficult stretch for the organization. On January 5, 2023, Mexican authorities, coordinating with American investigators from Homeland Security Investigations, had arrested Ovidio Guzman Lopez, one of the 4 Chapitos brothers, in a raid in the town of Jesus Maria in Sinaloa. The arrest had triggered an immediate and violent cartel response. Armed Zetas-style roadblocks across Culiacan, cartel gunmen in armored trucks, a military confrontation in the streets of the city that left dozens dead over the course of a single day. Ovidio was eventually extracted and held, and a formal extradition process began that would eventually deliver him to American courts. The capture of one of the 4 brothers was a significant blow to the organization's sense of invulnerability. Then, on April 14, 2023, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York unsealed a superseding indictment charging 3 of the 4 Chapitos brothers with 36 separate violations of federal law, centered on fentanyl trafficking, with charges that carried potential sentences of life in prison. On the same day, DEA Administrator Ann Milgram held a public announcement in which she stated that the DEA had successfully infiltrated the Sinaloa cartel and the Chapitos organization at the highest levels, claiming credit for intelligence access deep inside the network's inner circle. The announcement was deliberately public. The DEA was telling the world, and by extension, telling the Chapitos themselves, that people who had been sitting in their meetings and watching their operations and listening to their conversations had been providing that information to American investigators. For a cartel leadership that had just watched 1 brother arrested and 3 others indicted, that announcement was the equivalent of a lit match dropped into a room full of pressure. The Chapitos were now in the position of knowing, with certainty, that someone close to them had been talking. They did not know who. They did not know how many. They did not know how long the infiltration had been running or how much had been passed to the Americans. What they knew was that the DEA had been inside, and that finding whoever was responsible for that penetration and eliminating them was the most urgent security priority the organization faced. The response that the Chapitos and their security apparatus directed at this problem was consistent with how the organization had handled suspected informants throughout its existence. El Nini's record as the commander of the Ninis included a documented pattern of violence against people the cartel suspected of disloyalty or cooperation with law enforcement. According to the federal indictment filed against him in the Southern District of New York, in 2017, he and others had allegedly captured, tortured, interrogated, and killed 2 Mexican federal law enforcement officers. In that same year, he and others had allegedly captured 3 members of a rival cartel and subjected them to torture. Also in 2017, he and others had allegedly conspired to kill and retaliate against a witness and informant. Each of those incidents represented the same operational logic. The cartel identified a person who was providing information or who might provide information to authorities, and El Nini's unit removed them. In October 2023, that same logic was applied to a person the cartel had concluded was a DEA confidential source. The specifics of how the cartel identified the source are not publicly established with precision. What is documented in federal court filings is that the Chapitos and the people acting on their behalf had concluded that a specific individual was providing information to the American government in connection with the investigation that had generated the April 2023 indictment and the DEA's public claims of deep infiltration. Whether that identification was correct or not, whether the person targeted had actually been serving as a DEA source or had been wrongly identified through the cartel's internal investigation, is something the indictment treats as established. The indictment charges El Nini with obstruction of justice by murdering an informant, which reflects prosecutors' position that the person killed was in fact a cooperating source for the DEA. El Nini was arrested in Culiacan 5 weeks after the October 2023 killings, on November 22nd, by Mexican authorities acting on an arrest warrant. His arrest came as part of the broader enforcement action that American and Mexican investigators had been building toward. He was held in Mexican custody through the winter and into 2024, and on May 25, 2024, he was extradited to the United States and presented before U.S. Magistrate Judge Ona T. Wang in the Southern District of New York. At that appearance, he was arraigned on the charges contained in the Staney indictment, which covered the full scope of his alleged criminal career from 2012 through the October 2023 killings. Attorney General Merrick Garland, speaking at the time of the extradition, described El Nini as one of the Sinaloa cartel's lead sicarios and stated that he was responsible for the murder, torture, and kidnapping of rivals and witnesses who threatened the cartel's criminal drug trafficking enterprise, a description that placed the DEA source's killing within a documented pattern of similar conduct. The charges against El Nini carry consequences commensurate with their severity. The lead count in the Staney indictment, participating in a continuing criminal enterprise resulting in death, carries a mandatory minimum sentence of life in prison. The fentanyl trafficking conspiracy charges carry mandatory minimums of 10 years and maximum penalties of life. A firearms charge tied to the continuing criminal enterprise carries a mandatory minimum of 30 years. The practical effect of the charging structure is that if El Nini is convicted at trial, he will almost certainly spend the rest of his life in an American federal prison. The October 2023 killings did not happen in isolation from the broader political and legal context of the Chapitos' increasingly dangerous situation. They happened in a specific window, after the April 2023 indictment and the DEA's public claim of deep infiltration, before any of the remaining Chapitos brothers had been arrested or extradited, during a period when the cartel's leadership was simultaneously facing the most serious American legal threat in its history and trying to determine how much damage had been done by whoever had been providing the DEA with access to its inner workings. The killings were part of that effort. They were the cartel's attempt to close off the source of its exposure, to eliminate the person or persons responsible for the DEA's claimed penetration, and to send a message to anyone else who might be considering a similar arrangement that the consequences of that choice would be total. Whether the October 2023 killings are connected to the allegations made by Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa in his August 2023 letter to Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco is something the public record does not resolve. Grassley's letter alleged that 2 DEA cooperating sources embedded inside the Chapitos network had been murdered, and that this had happened during a period when the Justice Department was reportedly giving the DEA additional time to develop its own investigation rather than moving forward with charges that other agencies already had ready. The timing of Grassley's allegations, August 2023, and the timing of the October 2023 kidnappings, documented in El Nini's indictment, overlap in a way that suggests some of the same events may be reflected in both accounts, or that there were multiple distinct incidents of cartel violence against DEA sources during that compressed and violent period. Neither the Justice Department nor the DEA has publicly confirmed or denied a connection between what Grassley described in his letter and what the SDME indictment describes in El Nini's charges. What the El Nini case adds to the larger picture of how cartels treat people who cooperate with American investigators is something beyond what the earlier cases on this list illustrate. Barry Seal was killed because his identity had been publicly exposed. Jose Daniel Gonzalez Galeana was killed because the cartel suspected him and confirmed that suspicion through its own internal surveillance. Marisol Macias was killed because an anonymous online identity had been traced back to a real person. The Colombian DEA informant was killed because corrupt officials inside a joint law enforcement unit sold his photograph and name to the people hunting him. All of those cases involved a cartel finding a specific person and targeting them specifically. The October 2023 operation was different in its scale. 11 people were taken, 8 were killed. The cartel was not content to find the source and eliminate the source. It expanded the net to include everyone in the source's immediate orbit, on the logic which organized crime has applied consistently across every era and every geography, that eliminating one person's connections eliminates the possibility that those connections might preserve the information or the networks the source had been building. The 13-year-old who was killed had not cooperated with the DEA. There is no suggestion in any public document that the child had any knowledge of the source's role or any connection to American law enforcement beyond whatever relationship connected the child to the adult the cartel was hunting. The child was killed because the cartel had decided that killing everyone connected to a source was an acceptable and appropriate response to the threat posed by that source's cooperation. That calculation, applied to a 13-year-old, is the endpoint of the logic that runs through every case on this list. Cartels kill informants because informants cost them money, freedom, and operational security. The killing is rational in the narrowest sense of that word, a response to a threat, a message to potential future threats, an enforcement of the rule that cooperation with law enforcement has only one consequence. The rationality of the calculation does not make its results any less terrible. It makes them more so, because it means that the killing of a 13-year-old boy in Culiacan in October 2023 was not an accident or an excess or a loss of control. It was a decision made by people who had weighed the costs and benefits of what they were doing and concluded that the cost of leaving anyone alive was too high. El Nini is currently awaiting trial in the Southern District of New York. The case against him, built from federal indictment charges supported by investigative work from the DEA's Special Operations Division, its Bilateral Investigations Unit, and its offices in Mexico and Phoenix, along with assistance from the Office of International Affairs and multiple U.S. attorneys' offices, represents the American legal system's attempt to hold accountable a man whose role in the Sinaloa cartel's enforcement apparatus touched nearly everything described in his indictment. The DEA confidential source whose death is among those charges has no public name, no public history, and no publicly acknowledged family. The source exists in the court record as a category, a confidential informant, and as a charge, obstruction of justice by murder. The 13-year-old killed alongside the source exists in the same record in the same way, as one of 8, counted but unnamed. El Nini is in federal custody, awaiting the proceedings that will determine what accountability looks like for what happened to all of them in October 2023. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you